To tonight's Mercury retrograde in Aquarius-Capricorn. This is Media Monk, and I'm joined with Kim Marie on the other, in the other room actually. So I'll go ahead and turn it over to her, and we'll get started with tonight's information. Thanks for attending, everybody. This is a Pay It Forward webinar.
All right, welcome everyone to our Mercury retrograde in Aquarius-Capricorn. As you can see on your screen there, Mercury goes retrograde January 14th at 10.5 Aquarius, goes direct February 3rd, 24.5 degrees Capricorn. And as you can see right here on your screen, those rulers of Aquarius and Capricorn are Saturn and Uranus, and we're going to talk about them right up front because their last quarter square is not really going anywhere in 2022. We're still going to be in the midst of it. Before we get going with that, though, I have two housekeeping slides. Here are the various ways in which you can study evolutionary astrology with us at EAN. And as we are in the midst of a Venus retrograde from December 19th through January 29th, every time Venus goes retrograde, I offer a consultation special. You can get a compatibility reading for no extra charge on the extra chart. So if you are interested in that, it is good through January 29th. And it doesn't have to just be an intimate couple. It can be parent-child, co-workers, friends, anybody you may feel you have some karma with and you want a better understanding, whether a past relationship or a present relationship. And so as we get going tonight, here is a little more information for you, including the Mercury pre-shadow leading up to the retrograde and the dates for the post-shadow as well. We will show these dates and degrees several times tonight, so I'm just going to jump right in. I have a fair amount of slides, and it's going to kind of shift back and forth between looking at it from an individual perspective, and most of the charts are all from a collective perspective. So we'll weave in and out between how Mercury retrograde affects each of us individually and our participation in various collective groups. And so here are the days that Mercury is in Capricorn and Aquarius as it starts out, goes retrograde, and then does that third passage. Basically, Mercury will be in Capricorn for 39 days, as you can see the dates on your screen. And it will be in Aquarius for 61 days, 2 months in just the sign of Aquarius. So this retrograde cycle is definitely going to have a pretty strong Aquarian flair to it. And we'll show you those slides as we move forward. And so again, on your screen, you can see with Capricorn's rulership, Saturn's rulership of Capricorn and Uranus rulership of Aquarius, these two planets are going to figure pretty prominently in this Mercury retrograde cycle. And so Saturn and Uranus are the interface between our individuated consciousness, which is Saturn, and our individuated unconsciousness, which is Uranus. And together as a planetary pair, they create this natural tug-of-war between our societal pressures to conform, which is Saturn and Capricorn, and that whole individualization process that each of us go through as souls, which is related to Uranus and its rulership of Aquarius. And so together, they're on average a 45-year cycle. It can vary a few years, but they're average a 45-year cycle evolving technology, inventions, societal customs and taboos, and of course, our authority structures, including governments. And so all of our collective groups and countries evolve and change over time. No group or country stays static. And what can happen is sometimes those Uranian innovations can happen faster than the Saturnian laws can govern them. Just think briefly for a moment of social media and how Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and all the others that are out there have just, taken over. All of us receive our news and get information in the world, and various countries through Saturn's last quarter squares have been saying, how are we going to govern all of this Uranian technological innovation? Mercury's retrograde cycle is going to just cut to the chase as we've been looking at it over the last few years and bring up a lot of questions, possibly some answers in this time period of its retrograde cycle. Here's where the next conjunction is, and I'm going to get my little laser pointer so you can see this. Their next conjunction is 10 years away. We won't see it until 2032 when they meet in the skies at 28 degrees Gemini. So one of the things that will happen at last quarter squares is, while it's that crisis in consciousness and beliefs, nothing makes sense anymore. From that 270-degree mark until Saturn catches up with Uranus again, and they have that conjunction at 0 degrees, that last 90 degrees of the circle is a time period for laying the seed thoughts that will then burst into manifestation as they have a conjunction and start a brand new, in this case, 45-year cycle together. And so there's a lot of seed thoughts that have been laid in the last year or so with just Saturn and Uranus making these last quarter squares. This Mercury retrograde cycle can seem to accelerate it a little bit in whatever area you may look at it, be it, politics or real estate or healthcare or the climate change crises. There are seed thoughts being laid that we will see how they start gaining traction over the next 10 years leading up to this conjunction. One more thing about the last 90 degrees, last quarter phase, balsamic phase. To the degree that an individual or a group of people can let go of what no longer makes sense, crises in consciousness, Saturn, no matter to whatever no longer works as a structure, we open up space for those seed thoughts to actually manifest, germinate, start laying some groundwork before we even get to the conjunction. While this is not a common thing to happen, because we have a tendency to want security, it is possible. As you can see on your screen, during this Mercury retrograde cycle, Saturn square Uranus is within 2 to 5 degrees. They get as far as 9 degrees separating from the square, and then they come back within a 1-degree orb September and October. This last quarter square will one time be with us all through 2022, accentuated just, less than a month off of the last square, accentuated during this Mercury retrograde. And what it can bring up on some of the deepest perspectives is the debate between inclusive versus exclusive laws, policies, relationships, social systems. Inclusive in the world of EA is giving, sharing, and including. Exclusive principles are taking, hoarding, and excluding. And all you have to do, for instance, is take a look in the United States at the right to vote. Are we trying to do everything we can to include and give everybody a right to vote as easily as possible. Some countries, the national vote is a holiday. Or are we, as has been done in several states here in the US with Republican governors and or majorities, passing laws that take away the right to vote and make it harder? We hear this in the news. This will continue to be one of those issues that will be in the news throughout the rest of this year, as well as many others. And so when we have this last quarter square of Saturn to Uranus, outdated social support systems, political systems, tax systems, infrastructures, they're exposed, where they're breaking down and not working anymore, Saturn, and where we have that need for reform, Uranus. And of course, it requires courage to lay those seed thoughts into the future. Now, what will also be quite active during this Mercury retrograde is both Saturn transiting Aquarius and Uranus transiting Taurus are in what we call a push-pull between structures and norms of the past. This is the way we've always done it, and the need for evolution in order to survive. This is what's coming to change. We can't keep burning fossil fuels and hope to have a planet for our grandchildren. And consensus societies, which tend to be about 7 out of 10 souls in every country or group, they want to repeat and enforce that past in order to be secure. And the more change happens, the more they want to cling to yesterday, even as they see that writing on the wall. And so it creates these intense debates about past versus future choices. And again, this is very active Mercury retrograde, and it is very active in every single country across the planet, no matter the chart. Example, in the USA, COVID, as it is in many other places, is tearing down our healthcare system, and we're going to need to rebuild it, which you will watch us talking about in the news over the next decade with Saturn square Uranus. Hopefully we can move into universal healthcare before another 10 years, but it is moving us in that direction. We're the richest country in the world, and we have only 4.5% of the world's population. However, we have 15% of the world's COVID deaths. That is just mind-boggling. It is ridiculous that a country such as the USA, with its resources, has one of the sickest populations in the world and has some of the highest per capita death rates. This is a crisis that Saturn-Uranus has brought about, and that Mercury, as we go through the third year with Mercury retrograde covering Aquarius, somehow, some way, the third year. And it's almost like the masses are starting to say, wait a minute, we can't handle this anymore. And nowhere will we see those masses rise up more than in the whole world of healthcare. The shortage of workers, whether they're sick from COVID or they just can't get the staffing in anymore. One of our small communities an hour away from us closed down an urgent care clinic that has been open for, oh gosh, a good 10, 12 years because they have nobody to staff it. They just permanently closed it until further notice. Just one little example of what we're all dealing with in regards to this specific Mercury retrograde. Now, I'm going to move on a little bit more. We're going to talk collectively here, and then we'll go into Mercury specifically. But I always bring up the Mercury stationary retrograde chart, its interior conjunction to the sun, and it turning stationary retrograde. And so there's a couple of things. There's several things going on in the chart, but we can definitely see here that we have Moon opposing Mars, making a square to Neptune. It is a T-square that's going on, in addition to the fact that Jupiter is just a few degrees off of its square the nodes with the nodal axis. Both of these squares and their intensities have all of us asking, especially at the ending of this nodal axis transit, south node is Sag, north node Gemini. What is truth? What is lies? What do I believe? What actions do I need to take? And of course, this is easily reflecting this intense polarity that we have going on in the United States, which I'll speak to in the next slide. But I want you to then note that as Mercury turns stationary retrograde, it's only 3 degrees away from a conjunction to Saturn, and it is in a tight last quarter square itself. The slides before we just looked at, tight last quarter square to Uranus. And so Mercury is going to be triggering these reviews of how do we progress forward? What are the new innovations upon us? How are we choosing to participate in growth and evolution? Because that is the most basic law we have, evolution. We all keep evolving. If not, we'd all be 25 with our nice little mid-20s bodies if we could, stop Saturnian time, which we cannot do. And so I'll give you this ahead of time. Mercury aspects every planet except Saturn and Uranus. And yet look how close Mercury is to aspecting both of these planets, and it will pretty much, throughout all of its retrograde cycle. Finally, one of the other big energies with Mercury turning retrograde is that the Sun is moving towards its conjunction with Pluto, and they are both within degrees of the US natal Pluto, which is triggering what we call this collective soul identity crises that we are having in the United States. Oh, if you thought the last 5-6 years were wild, if you thought the last 2 years of the last year was wild, fasten your seatbelts for 2022, in the USA at least, with transiting Pluto going over the United States, natal Pluto, for the first time in the history of our country. Mercury retrograde is going to be triggering this all through the year with not 3 but 4 retrograde cycles. Light bulbs flashing through Aquarius, security triggers through Capricorn. How are we all going to move through it? Now, I read an article by Michael Minkowski about 3 years ago in the NCGR newsletter. It's a national astrology organization, if you don't know this. And he has spent decades of research on a time for the US, and I was impressed with the article. So I just started observing it and working with it. And 3 points that I want to make, because this is the chart that I've been using since last fall. By the way, the first time that I spoke in public about this chart, the July 4th, 9:37 a.m. time period. The first time I spoke out about this chart was last fall when I gave a lecture in LA at a Conscious Life Expo about the US Pluto return to general public. And as I was talking about this chart and US Pluto return, I said, look at in this 9:37 a.m. chart, the United States has a 5th house Pluto. And I made the comment, have you ever known a more egotistical, superiority complex country than the United States? I no more than said that sentence or question, and we had an earthquake, and the room shook. And I was like, oh, this is my first earthquake. Oh, universe, thank you for confirming me and my choice of USA charts. Now, I don't mean to denigrate any July 4th charts or any US charts. They all work, but I like to relay that little tidbit because it was quite exciting for me at the time. Wasn't too scary, but it was like, oh, one of those, goosebump deja vu moments. The second thing I want to point out to you is regardless of the time you use on July 4th charts, there are three major aspects that just reiterate this history since the beginning of our country of inclusive versus exclusive trends. The only two retrograde planets, Mercury and Pluto, oppose each other. Yep, Chiron gets dragged into a T-square. But we've got this polarity opposition with the gender issues, with the racial issues, with the financial wealth inequality issues that are all being triggered with this first Pluto return. Stay tuned. I have hope that we will progress and move forward. The second one is the fact that on the July 4th date, the US Sun, our personality, our life force, our creativity, is square Saturn in Libra. Do we have fairness and equality? Do we include or exclude? And then the third one is Mars in Gemini. Ooh, duality, include, exclude. Getting that, anybody? Making a last quarter square here to Neptune in Virgo. Many astrologers have felt that Neptune in Virgo in our natal US chart is the USA's puritanical, the Puritans, the religious, my God's better than your God energy that we have with this country, and our criticism, Virgo, of any other religion or belief system that differs than ours. Stay tuned. We'll see how that goes here over the next couple of months because it is triggered with this Mercury retrograde cycle. I'll show you in the next slide. Here is where I point to in regards to my persuasion in switching over to this 9:37 a.m. Virgo ascendant, and everything we want to say about Neptune can almost be extrapolated into that Virgo ascendant, that instinctive criticism and superiority complex. And with our neighbors as a country, with our relationships to other countries, we blindly accept them or blindly reject them without really looking at, facts or reality on the ground sometimes. But it's been pretty well established through historical research and records that the Second Continental Congress maintained a very consistent daily schedule for years, all the years it was in existence. They started 9 a.m. promptly. They finished up around 4:30 because everybody was hungry with no lunch. And that was just the pattern they established. They didn't have the distractions we had with social media and TVs and, airplanes and news traveling so fast. They were just pretty much right in that Pluto and Capricorn routine. In 1989, the Library of Congress released newly discovered old letters that were signed by Benjamin Franklin and others, quoting the signing of the Declaration of Independence between 9 a.m. and 11 a.m. And these old letters that were newly discovered, they came within the first few decades after the signing of the DOI. So they weren't going back, a long time period. Ask the mother who had 5 kids. Can you remember what time kid number 3 was born? And so it created that window in which Michael Minkesi then ran with all series of 20 different times. Mercury details here. 20 different time periods between 9 and 11, and he did like a 30-year window of all these events in the US, ran the computer methods, and then extrapolated it out from the beginning. Interestingly, when Saturn was in Gemini and we had 9/11, still fits on the midheaven of the USA's chart. I won't go into complete chart interpretation of this right now. I just want to give you the reasoning of why I am using this chart. We'll look at some details because I'm going to bring this chart up more than once as we move through Mercury retrograde. Mercury stationary retrograde. Remember when I said we had a Moon-Mars opposition square Neptune? We are just finishing up with Neptune's 5 oppositions to itself in 2020-21. And also, I think there were 3 last quarter squares to Mars in Gemini. You know, here again, this almost theological split between the Republicans and the Democrats over ideology of politics and all these various many ways that we have going on. My way is better than your way. And in addition to that, Mercury retrograde is going to make 3 conjunctions over the US South Node in Aquarius, pretty much the same degree anytime during July 4th. And Mercury is going to go over the natal US Pluto 3 times, no matter what time you use on July 4th. In addition to Mercury going over transiting Pluto 3 times as well. So these intense debates and upsets that are going to take place in our country, where we are reviewing our whole soul identity, what I'm calling that soul crises. But in addition to that, Mercury right now, the beginning of this year, over the US South Node, is having an ego crisis as well. Are we going to have that Aquarian fairness for everybody, or are we going to go into the distortions of Aquarian elitism and the poor can just eat cake? Stay tuned. Mercury's going to trigger a lot of intensity around this on a collective level. Now, I'm going to come back to this chart a couple more times throughout this webinar, but I'm just going to let things set for the moment. I'm sure you can understand the intensity that we are building up to right now this week. We're recording this a few days before Mercury turns retrograde. I'm going to shift to a little more Mercury retrograde background. And here's Mercury in 2022 by element. It is one of those rare years where we actually have Mercury retrograde 4 times, straddling January and December, just a couple of days there in the end of the year, but it is 4 Mercury retrogrades in a calendar year. Mercury retrograde cycles reverse through the elements. You know, they actually go water, air, earth, fire. Okay. And so you can see here how we are reversing from the air element to the earth element as you look over here on your screen. And so in general, the Mercury retrograde cycles in 22 are thoughts and communications. Last year, 21, the 3 Mercury retrograde cycles were all in air. Aquarius, Gemini, and Libra. Busybody. Thoughts, communications, talking, you know, chaos, everything just was so, if you want to reflect back on it, there was a lot of intellectual chaos because Mercury was in air signs for 6.5 months last year. That's going to slow down as these retrograde cycles go back into the earth element and we spend a third of the year in earth. So thoughts and communications are going to turn to practical realities. Just think about this Venus retrograde right now. Mercury in Capricorn for a while and coming back into it. Who isn't going down to, wonder what I'll find in the grocery stores when I go to go get groceries next week or this week? what kind of shortages are going to be going on. We've been seeing it right here where we live. I think it will take most of this Mercury retrograde cycle to straighten out the grocery store shortages, because a lot of it is going to depend upon the supply chain issues with COVID work shortages. By the way, in case you're not aware of this, we just had Mercury retrograde. The Kroger grocery store workers, the King Soopers, go on strike in Colorado. 8,400 people went on strike. I don't know if you remember, in Boulder, a few miles from where they had the fire, they had a gentleman come into a King Soopers grocery store with a machete, not a gun, a machete. He killed 10 people in the grocery store. And so the workers are not only protesting work conditions, they're asking for security. They're asking for trainings on what to do to defuse a crazy person coming into their store. So talk about a political or a practical reality hitting Coloradans pretty intensely right now, is all these workers going on strike as Mercury goes retrograde. It's going to be quite interesting to see how long the strike lasts. Does it end when Mercury goes direct at 24 Capricorn? Stay tuned. You can watch it in the news yourself. Point is that these Mercury retrograde cycles are going to be getting to the essence of any messaging with direct words. Mercury in the earth element. We will see this played out in our midterm elections in the US on a political basis. Now, why planetary retrogrades? I go through this with every class on this. It's a geocentric phenomena. It appears to go retrograde from Earth. It is a time period to break free from consensus conditionings and define our own individual laws. It's always in a state of changing when a planet is retrograde. Sign house defines the manifestation. Opposite sign house, clarity and expression. And any transiting retrograde planet must relate back to the natal archetype. In this case, wherever your natal Mercury is in your chart. And if you were born with Mercury retrograde, you will experience a temporary harmony during a transiting Mercury retrograde cycle. Give you an example. I use this sometime. I have a nephew who has been interested in astrology since 8th grade. And, he just asked Aunt Kimmy. He's in his mid-30s. He was born with Mercury retrograde. He got married just shy of a year ago. His wife, natal Mercury retrograde, and she's a mortgage loan officer. And what are they doing? They are closing on a house as Mercury is retrograde, so they can take advantage of the low interest rates on their mortgage. Yes, they're paying more for a house than they have before, but they are a family of 4, and they are going to have a mortgage payment that is equal to their rent payment. So even with the interest on the mortgage or the extra price, it's still going to be better for them building up equity. So there's the point. My nephew is well aware of Mercury retrograde, and when it goes retrograde, he takes advantage of it being a good time for him. The rest of us, not so much, but he loves it. Here is the Mercury astronomy. It's never more than 29 degrees away from the sun from our perspective here on Earth. While it will go around the sun in 88 days, its dance with the Earth creates those 3 to 4 retrograde cycles a day. Here's the visual of how Mercury would look in the heavens if we could see it in the nighttime sky throughout its whole retrograde cycle. I always put these 2 slides up. Here's the Mercury has currently rulership of 2 archetypes. The outer side of Mercury is Gemini in the 3rd house with its active polarity in the air element. active energy moving outward from the center. I'm going to go fast over these. You're going to have the PDF PowerPoint slides that you can refer to and you can print out for your perusal later. Mercury's rulership of Virgo in the 6th house is the inner side of Mercury with the passive polarity and the earth element. And the inner comes from the passive polarity, which is energy moving inward back to the center. And so again, this is a little fast going over these slides. They're in every Mercury retrograde. So for many of you, it might be, yeah, seeing that one, Kimmery. Mercury retrograde in general, releasing that excess thought because our mind is saturated and we just can't take in any more ideas or details. Leroy and I, lately have been going, you didn't hear me. You're not listening to me. I told you, you didn't hear me. You're not listening to me. I told you. And as I'm prepping for this class, I'm going, of course, we're in Mercury's pre-shadow, getting closer and closer to it, turning retrograde. We're, feeling a little chaotic. How can we expect to hear each other? So take a deep breath, turn inward, quiet yourself, think things through, and then try to gain that best clarity on speaking, making sure that you actually have that other person's attention or eyeball to eyeball and going, this is important, I need you to hear this, and vice versa. Mercury retrograde is learning to trust our intuition first and the facts second. And the reason for this is Mercury retrograde is taking us from left brain to right brain. Its rulership of Gemini naturally points to Sagittarius and ruler Jupiter, right brain. Its rulership of Virgo points to Pisces and its rulership was Neptune, whole brain. So that whole mutable quadrant gets activated and it's slowing down left brain and allowing right brain to operate whenever Mercury is retrograde. Now, finding the quiet time in the busyness of retrograde overload is easier said than done. I will fully admit this with my Sun Mercury conjunction a half a degree apart. My Mercury is half a degree past my Sun, exterior conjunction, Mercury direct. I know what it's like during Mercury retrograde to get overloaded with all kinds of details. We all do. That's why the slide before is so important and why we do need to pay attention to all those mercurial things, driving, electronics, technology, the multiple communications until it's clear, doing things more than once to integrate and evolve and or release, and slowing down and taking the time to do it the best way. I have some PowerPoint slides that I've used for a few years that I copy and paste. It's when I get into the details of Mercury to the individual planets, and somehow the slides got goofed up to where the quotes wouldn't work in the slides. And I spent yesterday redoing those slides from scratch with my new words and quotes that work. I had thought, okay, let's just slow down and do it correctly so that goes forward in my future Mercury retrograde classes better. So I think you can see the difference here right now with Mercury retrograde and the left brain, right brain calming down that we all have to do. All right, let's take a look at some more specifics of Mercury retrograde in Aquarius-Capricorn. Excuse me for a moment as I take a drink. An intense tug of war, as we were saying before, with Saturn square Uranus, between yesterday and tomorrow. Capricorn wants to defend the past, sometimes no matter how dysfunctional that past may be, patriarchal distortions from natural law. Aquarius can want to leap forward into tomorrow, the rebel, sometimes before they think it through or create a strategy. Now, Capricorn is the cardinal modality, which is always initiating. And it does it via 2 steps forward, 1 step back. So it allows for integration when fear of the unknown rises. So we move forward till we get insecure, then we go back 1 step, integrate it to move forward again, then back up to integrate. The net effect is moving forward. The fixed modality, which is Aquarius, wants to maintain and persevere. It operates via pressure building up until our entire environment erupts in change, sometimes explosive, traumatic changes. This is because evolving forces, the force of change, will always overcome the resisting forces of that fixed modality. Now, Mercury retrograde is going to trigger all of this, and it will be unique to your own individual charts where you have planets in either cardinal signs or fixed signs and how they are being triggered by Mercury. And so take time, look at those degrees between 11 Aquarius to 24 Capricorn, where that is in your chart and how that will create changes for you. Mercury retrograde in Aquarius is about learning to decondition from all those conditioning factors. When it retrogrades back into Capricorn, again, we're going to have that fear factor come up and go, oh no, I'm changing too fast. I don't know if I can do this. But the deconditioning, as you can see here, is almost every area of life. It doesn't matter where it is operating for you. Aquarius is the rebel. It asks you to break free. And then it asks you to detach from the immediacy of your environment. You know, just think about what's going on in your world right now and where you're being triggered. How well can you take a breath and detach from it? Because what you're trying to do in that detachment is search for some objectivity. And then that's going to allow your personal life to have a little bit of awareness, Mercury, of what needs to change, how it needs to change, where it needs to change in your world. Believe me, Mercury retrograde in Aquarius will make it conscious for you. Again, the intent here is going to be to liberate ourselves. Retrogrades, throwing off, reviewing what we don't need, throwing it off. But the liberation on an egoic basis into our individualized soul nature. And Mercury's a conscious trigger. This requires us to be a group of one and to individuate and change however that evolution is presenting itself. It can create alienation, group of one, alienating from friends and other groups because we need to think for ourselves, Mercury. It's teaching us to balance the freedom of our own thoughts and our own ideas with what others in our life may say or what other groups may say. This is a natural time period to redefine friendships and redefine your groups and how you want to be in your groups. Maybe there's a social activist group that you've been a part of for a long time period, but it just doesn't work for you anymore. And it may be time to release it, to let it go. And perhaps there's another social activism group that's on the horizon that is showing the way of the new you, and it excites you, and it is something that you are wanting to move towards and move into. This is a natural time period to do it. I've been in process over the last year or two of letting go of one of my groups. It's my master gardening group. I realize I've learned as much as I want to learn. I don't care to do the volunteer work anymore. I don't care to record my hours anymore. It's been falling away for a while. Jupiter, Saturn, and Pluto over my ascendant in 2020, 2019, 2020. And I have, really just realized with this Mercury retrograde coming along as we are planning our spring fever, that I can choose to participate and volunteer at this major day-long education project without having to be a bona fide master gardener anymore. So I'm releasing the group as I'm choosing new ways in which I am going to participate in it. And I was asked to run the book sales. That's always been my thing to do. I still like to do that. I'm still going to do that within the group. But I've let go of another participation that I used to be quite active in because it's just not there for me anymore. So we're all going to have those examples of some collective area where it's maybe not working for us anymore. And it's okay to let go and open up the space for something new to come along. And for me, the bigger cycles over my ascendant, I'm opening up the space to have more time for me, first house. This Mercury retrograde is taking place entirely within my first house of self. Now, collectively, Mercury retrograde in Aquarius is going to trigger our three various groups that are defined by Aquarius. The defenders of the past, which are Saturn, they're going to be very triggered by this Mercury retrograde. The avant-gardes, or the rebels, which are related to Uranus. Things aren't moving forward fast enough. They're just as triggered. But we'll also have those who are either afraid to be different or don't care, don't pay any attention. It's a mixture of Saturn and Uranus. Who knows? They may be triggered too in some way. They maybe don't pay any attention to groups, so who knows? They could be triggered in their family environment. They could be triggered with their friends in some way. These three groups all have subgroups. They all have extremists. They can commingle back and forth. They all will face some degree of change with Mercury retrograde. For instance, another example here, collectively, Joe Biden went down to Georgia and gave a speech on voting rights, and several groups chose to boycott because they thought he needed to address it a year ago when he first was elected president. And Georgia brought two Democratic senators into election, which gave the Democrats the majority in the US Senate. So different ways it can happen. We also, both individually and collectively, will look at that impulse to change in three different ways. Resist, cling to the past, Saturn. Embrace change altogether, Uranus. Change in some ways, resist others. Most common reactions, Saturn and Uranus. Think about something on a personal level in your life right now that you're recognizing. I need to change. What can happen for many of us in the Northern Hemisphere after the holidays? I need to have better diet, exercise, and rest. Are you resisting it? Are you going overboard? Are you doing it some, resisting it in other ways? We're all going to have a unique combination. Bottom line, it's a third example is the most common because most of us have a fear of changing direction. That Saturn security versus the Uranian insecurity is strong. Now, when it comes to changing into the future with Mercury retrograde, you got to pay attention to that element of future messages. And this is future messaging pops up all on its own. Driving your car, commuting to work if you're not working out of home, or as I say, doing dishes, mowing the lawn, changing the baby's diapers. Boom, message pops in. Boom, message pops in. Clairvoyant, you see it. Clairaudient, you hear it. Clairsentient, you feel it. If it comes once or twice, it's fantasy or distant future, meaning 5, 10, 15 years down the road. If it comes again, it's where you are meant to be changing directions, Mercury retrograde right now. Now, I just thought I'd just briefly say, because Mercury and, oops, Uranus isn't spelled correctly. Oh, well, we won't worry about that one. Mercury and Uranus have co-rulership of the nervous system in general. Uranus does have rulership of the brain and the central nervous system. So when Mercury's retrograde in Aquarius, our whole nervous system can just get fried. This is where it becomes very important to take those deep breaths, to take that walk, to be able to calm down, to meditate if that's what works for you. However you work to calm your nervous system down, this becomes very important. Mercury retrograde in general, especially Mercury retrograde in Aquarius. One of the things about Uranus ruling the brain is it rules dendrites, which are the areas of the brain that hold memory and new knowledge. Mercury retrograde is the time period to search for new knowledge. What's on the horizon for you to look at differently? What's showing up as a new class or a new group or a new situation? And of course, it also has rulership of the synapses, which are those electrical messages that fire in our brain and go across those little spaces between the dendrites. And it creates that message that we call what fires together, wires together. And so Mercury retrograde is a time period to rewire the brain, literally. And it also can include extreme distortions of what you see on the screen with various mental illnesses and imbalances, or anarchy going, crazy wild, etc. So here we see Mercury retrograde in Aquarius driving all things electrical, technological, and astrology in general. Another little leap of astrologers getting the general message out there that over the years I've watched happen more and more and more. Mercury also, Aquarius also relates to that archetype of trauma. Current life, past lives. Mercury can be really triggering this essence of trauma in our world. And when we have trauma that exists on a subconscious level, it creates behavioral reactions. We're over-triggered to something that isn't that big of a deal because of that traumatic effect. And Mercury retrograde in Aquarius is that time period to really make that effort to change those effects of a trauma. However you want to, alternative or traditional. Mercury retrograde in Aquarius is especially about throwing it up into the air versus wanting to do the Capricornian suppression of it. Mercury retrograde in Capricorn will try to do those suppressions, but not so successful when Mercury's retrograde. I've said this before. The Aquarius archetype relates to what we would call a contagion. We can have physical contagions such as a disease, or something is communicated from one person to another by close contact or fluids. But we also can have the fixed air element here, the psychology of a contagion, the spread of a behavioral pattern, attitude, or emotion from person to person or group to group. The fact that 3/4 of Republican voters in the United States believe the big lie and think that Biden stole the election from Donald Trump. That is a psychological contagion. Let's hope it's going to be wearing itself out here with this Mercury retrograde, and as Saturn moves through its last full year in Capricorn, showing us the reality of what is truth and not happening. Briefly, a couple more slides on COVID. As we said, 4.5% of the world's population, yet 15% of the world's deaths. It's causing individual and collective traumas all over the place. The long-term side effects that we call long haulers. Many of us might know somebody who's been affected by this. It will have that potential, as we said earlier, to change our healthcare systems and how governments respond to communicable diseases. It's not guaranteed, but Mercury retrograde is going to show us the distortions of how, the rich have more testing than the poor. The rich have more vaccines. The rich are sometimes less affected than the poor. And of course, here we are with all of the great debates, especially in the United States, over the long-term benefits and side effects of the vaccines. We don't know long-term effects yet. And we're starting to see the fact that mutations of this coronavirus, the Omicron variant that we are now seeing, rendering the vaccine less effective for those who choose to get it. And we also don't know the timelines. All this stuff. We are 2 full years through COVID. I said we would go through the effects of COVID very directly all the way through Saturn in Aquarius. Saturn does not go into Pisces until March of 23. We have a full year yet of Saturn in Aquarius. I expect more variants to come through. I think the Omicron variant will decrease through this Mercury retrograde. But as Mercury retrogrades back into Capricorn and then goes back into Aquarius for another month, will there be another variant that comes out? There's already another variant coming out of Africa that I want to say they're calling UHF or UHI. I haven't heard a lot about it, but I don't think the Omicron is the last variant we're going to be looking at. And the big question is, when Pluto goes into Aquarius 23, 24, it's going to have 2 retrograde cycles back into Capricorn. Will we achieve the mass herd immunity that makes the virus endemic? No big deal. Or will something else come along with Pluto and Aquarius? We don't know yet. I'd say that the year 2022, with all these Mercury retrogrades and Saturn in Aquarius, and by the way, the Jupiter, Neptune, Pisces, and their conjunction, Pisces and Neptune ruling the immune system, it's going to take us most of this year to see how things play out. I think we'll see the summer calm down again. But I do think Mercury retrograde can still stir things up for us over the next few months. We're in the midst of it already. Stay tuned. As Mercury retrogrades back into Capricorn, it's going to create a mental review of the soul structure of consciousness, that individuated consciousness, that's Saturn, and how it creates every manifested form in our world. So it's going to draw us inward to self-reflect on our outer world, especially where the outer world is not working for ourselves. One of the reasons why we have the supply chains in grocery stores last year, this year, we saw it last year with toilet paper. Now we're seeing it more directly with food. Less people are eating out at restaurants. More people are buying groceries and cooking their own food. How are you making your food budget last longer with inflation? How are you changing your cooking habits, your eating habits? This can be Mercury retrograde in Capricorn in the practical reality of food. It also, though, can show us the inner motivations of our actions, why we do the things we do, and can we change those things? A year from now, Mercury's retrograde will be entirely in Capricorn. That December 29th through mid-January of Mercury retrograde. I'm trying to see if I can get the dates really close for us. That is, going to December 29th, 22, January 18, 23. Mercury's going to be retrograde entirely in Capricorn. And so you're getting seed thoughts in this Mercury retrograde cycle as it gets back into Capricorn of where you're going to be at a year from now. So as you're thinking about these inner motivations and these actions you take to create your world, maybe make some notes, especially if you print out this PDF slide. And then you can review this a year from now when Mercury goes retrograde again. How well did you focus on the priorities of your material world? How did you change your actions of self-discipline and self-responsibility? I said in my 2022 forecast, which I did last week and is available on our website, Venus and Mercury's retrograde cycles in Capricorn are starting the year off with an intense seriousness. And it will really trigger our outer securities, whether they're actually vulnerable or we just feel that way. And those triggers can create a sense of depression or helplessness, or what difference does it make? What's important to realize is this is natural for Mercury retrograde in Capricorn. It turns us inward to see what's not working. It also will turn us inward to review the standards of right, wrong conduct that create our judgments. Are we in the consensus world, and consensus society, says this is right and this is wrong, so we agree with it? Are we breaking free and going, I'm going to discern right, wrong conduct for myself? And then that's how I'm going to base my movements going forward. How I will survive in this changing, chaotic world. How I will survive in the United States, the transiting Pluto over natal Pluto 3 times in Capricorn. That Mercury's going to also trigger 3 times, the multiple ways I showed you before, just during January, February, and March. Prioritize this Venus. So, this retrograde in Capricorn will create serious conversations around career, money issues. I spoke a lot about money and economics in the 2022 forecast. If you care to look at some of the new things I have been mentioning in that regard. It will create the conversations around gender issues and equality, our familial situations. What's going on in your families of origin right now? What is showing up with your families that are in need of change and review? Leroy and I were on call to be mini backups for Grandma with our 12-year-old niece, as my sister was going to go to an educational conference in Florida. Her flight got changed 3 different times, to the point that she informed me today she's staying home because the airlines can get her to Florida, but they can't get her home. They would strand her in Dallas and she'd have to be there until whatever happened. And she went, nah, I don't think I'm going to do this. And her text ended, Mercury retrograde with 5 apostrophes. This is a time period with Mercury retrograde in Capricorn to find the self-determination and discipline to take charge of our own life, no matter what, whether we're working or retired, whether we're participating in society or just wondering where we're going to, have enough food. It also is showing us some way in which we have to have some maturation in our world. And with Mercury, others are going to be very willing to give us some feedback. Just prior to Mercury turning retrograde, Leroy and his two sisters had to have a conversation with their elderly mother, and the whole point of the issue was mom needed to act her age. We won't go into the details. How well can you listen, and how well can you speak up to give others feedback wherever you feel it is necessary? Now, Mercury can help Capricorn with flexibility in our material world choices. And those choices may come down to needs versus want. Yes, I would like to take this trip, but I don't need to take the trip. Yes, I would like to have this particular upgrade in my home, but I don't need it. Venus comes into this picture as well. Overall, I think many of us on an individual basis are noticing a need to conserve resources and money around this sense of uncertainty. Not only with the inflation, I covered that in the 22 podcast, but also, just the seriousness of the Pluto return. You don't have to be an astrologer to feel it going on within you. Now, remember we said that the retrogrades pointed to the opposite sign, and for each of us personally, an opposite house that would give clarity and expression to the Mercury retrograde. For Mercury retrograde in Capricorn, it's a Cancer polarity. It's finding that sense of inner security on those emotional, mental levels, regardless of what's happening outside of us. It's that typical reaching for a better feeling thought. Seeing that cup half full, says Virgo. It's internalizing those security needs instead of collecting more and more material stuff. We may have emotional shocks that require us to mentally review what happened, why it happened. Emotional shocks are going to directly reflect on our self-image, how we see ourselves, and how we are participating on planet Earth. It is also there to help us feel our way through any crystallized mental patterns. We can think one way, but it doesn't feel good. How can we change our thoughts to feel better? We can also have a reflection from those emotional shocks on what are the internal dynamics in our world that's creating those outer circumstances. With Cancer Capricorn, whenever Capricorn can't will its way forward, the polarity Cancer says we've got to do the inner work. Inner reflects outer. Our inner world creates the outer world. And so this Mercury retrograde changed that inner world as much as you're making any effort to change things outwardly. Can you feel at peace and secure through this time period we're living in? And of course, the Cancer polarity will almost specifically point to family issues that need to be addressed through new communications, through changing familial patterns. And it can cause us to recognize that deeply giving and receiving love means more than anything we can have in this material world. Now, the Leo polarity, when Mercury is retrograde in Aquarius, it's asking us for the courage to break free and take charge of our own life. In other words, those societal standards of right, wrong conduct may or may not work for us as individuals. And so it's going to be okay to be different, to be unique. This is that Leo courage to be me, to be that group of one, even if we're alienated from others. It also requires us to start putting our future ideas and possibilities into actions, because Aquarius and Leo are fixed polarities, and Aquarius is fixed air. We've got all kinds of ideas, Mercury retrograde, but we don't do anything about it. Those ideas go unacted upon. So we've got to put things into action with Mercury. You're going to see here in a couple of slides that Mercury makes 2 different aspects to Mars 3 times. This Mercury retrograde has 6 aspects to Mars. You talk about taking action. Oh yeah, it's here. And of course, we have to link our individual creativity, Leo, with social needs, Aquarius. It requires us to revisit inner versus outer love. You know, this can be a time period of bringing in those love triangles and the traumas, especially as the nodes reverse back into Taurus, Scorpio. That if we're working on a deep inner security, we recognize that self-love is just as important as anything else. And it will be reflected in that outer world of ours. We have to use that opportunity to objectify and therefore work to heal any areas where we have emotionally arrested wounds and traumas. This is Leo following Cancer. If our inner world is not acknowledged or understood by our parents to be who we are uniquely, it can arrest us emotionally. Mercury retrograde Aquarius Leo is a time period to detach, observe it, recognize it, do what we can to change it. Because otherwise, we're just going to project that childhood woundedness forward into our adult relationships. We're going to be looking for a missing mommy or daddy instead of an adult partner. We can have a partner want to project that onto us. Also, Mercury wants us to recognize the role that we are here to play in our unique situation and circumstances, Capricorn, versus that desire to direct or play God. I'm in charge. Just listen to me. No, it doesn't quite work that way. That causes us to have more of those Aquarian shocks and traumas in our world, or the Cancer emotional shocks to go, oh, wait a minute, I have to play fair in the sandbox. We review creative self-actualization and all the various ways that woundedness of a starving artist will show up. I will, my will, divine will. Everyone is unique and has a creative role to play. What is the world asking of me? Mercury retrograde in Aquarius. And finally, I would like to say that Leo polarity asks us to recognize the abundance in the natural world. While our Capricorn insecurities can be triggered, the universe is abundant. And it will be abundant for a long, long, long time. It's going to be a very, very long time before the sun combusts inward on itself and becomes a Death Star and black hole. So there's a lot of abundance in the world. Use that Leo polarity with this Mercury retrograde and find that creativity for yourself and how you want to manifest it going forward. Now, evolutionary astrology always talks about the 360 cycle of phases and aspects and how active Mercury really is in a retrograde cycle. Here is a slide for that in case you want to refer to it later on. Here are the aspects Mercury retrograde makes. It makes 3 different aspects to the Venus, once each. Here's the 2 aspects to Mercury 3 times. And here it is aspecting Jupiter, Chiron, Neptune, Pluto, and the nodes. As I said before, the only planets it doesn't aspect is Saturn and Uranus. And look at how it went stationary retrograde, conjunct Saturn, square Uranus, still within orb. That this Mercury retrograde is activating everything. It is an active Mercury retrograde. Now, here's your slide one more time to show you the pre-shadow dates, the actual retrograde time period, and then the post-shadow dates. So you can see that those 3 passages of Mercury are active in our charts for a full 2 months. Here is the detail of the different aspects that we're going to look at. But first of all, let's look at them visually when Mercury makes the interior conjunction to the sun when it's retrograde in the underworld. An interior conjunction on January 23rd. It takes place at 3.5 degrees Aquarius. And in this chart, the moon and Chiron make an opposition with the T-square to Neptune. Neptune turns stationary direct January 29th. So Neptune is slowing down to turn direct about 10 what was that, 10.5 degrees, no, 11 degrees, exactly 11 degrees Capricorn. So I wrote peace versus war, how to get along, Libra, Aries. Venus stationary direct is bringing our evolving values into our consciousness in big ways. And I think Venus stationary direct is also going to have all the issues around resources and money and material goods still in the news. And so the highlight of a Mercury retrograde to the sun is the aha moment. So will we see, politicians or the Federal Reserve in the US or the Treasury Department? Will we see some big news come along with this interior conjunction that changes things, that perhaps works to help the masses, Aquarius? We don't know. We're just going to have to see how it unfolds. But I also want to point out the fact that Mars is still at the tail end of Aquarius, one more day, making a last quarter orb to Neptune and Pisces that we saw so strong in the chart when Mercury went stationary retrograde. So nothing lasts forever. I think over this Mercury retrograde, and of course through the rest of this year and the Pluto returns, there's going to be the slow unfolding of truth in regards to the big lie of Donald Trump losing the election, and at least more and more of the general public recognizing, that's not what happened. It's my intent. You can't cry wolf for 5 years and expect something to change. It's going to slowly die off. I hope that we will see it over these next few years. I do have Donald Trump's chart coming up here in just a moment. Here is the interior conjunction on the Munkacy USA chart. This Mercury retrograde to the sun is, just a few degrees from the US South Node. That ego of the past as a collective people, and again, the include, exclude. Will we be confronting our public past as a collective, or will we have that denial of reality and banning more critical race theory in our legislatures this year, which is what our governor is trying to do here in South Dakota, as well as try and one up Mississippi and Texas on banning abortions, as well as trying to beat the public to the punch in regards to the legalization of cannabis. That's a long story. I won't go into that one. I'll just say that the third time we had the legalization of cannabis on our ballot, we made it a constitution, an initiative to change our constitution, and we, in one fell swoop, we were legalizing medical, legal, and hemp, and it won 54% of the vote. Our governor immediately turned around and contested it to the state Supreme Court. They took a year to decide it, and they defeated it just a few weeks ago. So I think there's two initiatives to put the legalization on the ballot again. Our state legislature slowly coming around to the light. There's been like 25 bills on the legalization of cannabis introduced in our state legislature. We'll see how that goes forth. We're still going to have the issue on the ballot in our state again. Stay tuned. South Dakota will probably be in the news around that issue for the next year or so as we try and figure that one out. But we also, again, as we talked about this moon Chiron opposition with a T-square from Venus, as Venus is slowing down to go direct, Venus is directly across from the US sun, bringing in a grand cross on this interior conjunction. And so what other public upheavals are going to be starting here at the beginning of the year, leading up to the first US Pluto return, February 21st, I think it is. I put my little quote in here. Leroy and I have said this for the last 3-4 years, or I have said it. If I didn't have astrology, I would be depressed. And that's my specific quote for the US Pluto return. I'm like, oh, can we get to this Pluto return fast enough? Can we get to Pluto new phase, the natal US Pluto, and actually start moving forward with things? Can we get to Pluto in Aquarius? Well, I've had to think for myself and go, wait a minute. If you think that the United States is going to have 3 transiting returns of Pluto to its natal spot and come away unscathed or no big events, your head's in the sand. We just don't know what the upsets and surprises will be, other than it will be themes of power and powerlessness, who controls government, who controls our resources, our economics, or monetary policies, are, all the themes we've been talking about. The degree to which we are all involved is going to decide how all this turns out. But every Mercury retrograde chart I have here is very, very active on the US chart. I wanted to bring up this slide that I used in the Venus retrograde. Venus goes stationary retrograde, conjuncting Pluto twice, very close to the natal US Pluto. Mercury, of course, goes retrograde at 11 Aquarius, and then Mercury goes stationary direct on transiting Pluto within degrees, and on the natal US Pluto within degrees. So Venus started off the end of last year going, wait a minute, what do we value in the material world? A little softer than Mercury going stationary direct here in the beginning of February and Jan beginning Feb. There'll be a 1-2 punch. Now, obviously, we can see, food chains. We can see the whole COVID situations. We can see the voting rights situation. There will be more things that will be coming up. You see, we have that Sun conjunction to Pluto here coming a few days after Mercury turns retrograde. Later on, we're going to have Mars conjunct Pluto, Venus conjunct Pluto, and then they're both going to go into Aquarius and conjunct themselves. This is in the sky. This is transiting Pluto conjunctions. But you can just see how strongly it's creating these themes of re-evaluating excess materialism, climate change realities, resource control and finances, governmental authority, etc., etc. As I said before, 4.5% of the world's population, 25% of the world's resources. It is unsustainable. We in the United States will learn how to use less resources going forward in the long run because we will have no other choice. It is unsustainable for the rest of the world to live like we do. So we will be adjusting to the rest of the world. We'll see how that turns out. I wanted to show you this before we moved into those 3 aspects Mercury makes to Venus, all 3 of them, while Mercury is direct. Mercury and Venus are always in aspect during a Mercury retrograde, during a Venus retrograde. Venus has been ahead of Mercury, which means our mind is slowing down because we keep reflecting upon how we want to implement those evolving values of Venus. And when Venus is ahead of Mercury, that means Venus is getting ready to do a retrograde cycle, which it is doing. Then it conjuncts together, and Mercury moves ahead of Venus. And then the mind starts to race ahead, wanting to support the values and needs that are important to Venus. You can reflect upon this for yourself. Sometimes these aspects feel so fast that it's like, oh, I can't make sense of those. They just flip by and I don't even notice them on the astrological calendar, myself included. I do like to point out the patterns. Here's Mercury waxing to Mars. It gets 60 degrees ahead and then it slows back down to 45 degrees ahead. Excuse me, said that backwards. It gets 45 degrees ahead, then it slows down to only 30 degrees away from Mars, but it stays ahead of Mars this whole time. All these aspects are going to create lots of energy and actions, too many details. Here's that activity of Mercury we were talking about. It doesn't always have 6 aspects to Mars. Typically, it's only 3, once in a while, 2. So this is a lot. And this creates that struggle in how we're keeping up with everything. But it also is going to ask us to move forward. Step by step by step, Capricorn, regardless of what's going on in our personal world, regardless of what's going on in the world. And the fact that Mars is going through 3 of the signs in the second half, ruling collectives and collective ideas, we still have to look at the bigger picture as we are all moving forward, no matter what. Now, Mercury turns to being in the waning half of the circle to the rest of the outer planets that it aspects. Mercury has 3 waning semi-sextiles, 330 degrees to Jupiter. This is left brain definitely surrendering to right brain. Make an effort to see that larger picture, then fill in the details. Now, ideas can spark with Aquarius, but we've got to take the time to be quiet, to be able to understand what we can do versus what is fantasy or further forward into the future, as we expressed before and already spoke about. Mercury waning to Chiron, they're going to make waning sextiles here at the 300 mark in last quarter phase. This also is reflection. but it can allow, the waning sextile can definitely allow new ideas to come through. Mercury Chiron, it's new ideas for healing. What are we doing the beginning of the year or the winter in the Northern Hemisphere? Reflecting on diet, exercise, and rest protocols. Are we implementing new ideas or routines in our world? How are we learning to live with COVID-19 and all its variations? Are we allowing others to be free to decide for themselves whether to vaccinate or not? I think Chiron in Aries sometimes is creating a lot of these intense debates that are going forward in whether to vaccinate or not. And I will say, in a year of having the vaccines, in both of my businesses, doing that Aquarian observation, whether you're liberal or conservative, I have found on the liberal side, intense debates between vaccinate or not. I have found on the conservative side, intense debates whether to vaccinate or not. We are an extremely conservative state in South Dakota. I think we voted for Donald Trump 67% in 2020, the mid 60s. And yet our vaccination rate in our state is 67%. We have a high percentage of elderly. So Chiron in Aries is creating that intensity of the debate, but when it comes to the vaccines, I don't see it owned by either side. And I just, a year ago, decided that I was going to detach and allow others to choose what they want to do. If people ask me, I share what my personal choice was. My personal choice was to vaccinate, and I did it because of two elderly mothers that Leroy and I take care of. And I did it because my elderly mother asked me if I would vaccinate for her. Would I have done it without my mother? I don't know. But I did it for my mom without a single regret. It was my personal choice. And I invite all of us to allow everybody to have the personal choices. Again, that's probably enough to say. I wonder if the vaccines will keep up with the mutations. I think they will start to get less effective. Stay tuned. We'll see how we go forward with that. I'm sure the pharmaceutical industries are already working on mutations of the vaccine to keep up with mutations of the virus. Mercury waning to Neptune. These are waning semi-squares, which are going into balsamic phase. And so there's a deep need to honor rest and inner reflection through all of this extremely active Mercury retrograde cycle. Mercury retrograde, again, is right brain orientated. And with Neptune, it's about allowing the intuitive hits to surface in order to make sense of the chaos in our world. Now, with both Jupiter and Neptune in Pisces together, they're going to offer the ability to search for deep truths that are in harmony with natural laws that are always found in nature. So show me the broadest level of truth I can understand. Show me where I'm buying into a lie. But we also must be careful of wanting to look to escape or avoid through indulgence in addictive substances and or behavior, blindly believing the big lie, no matter how many court cases of fraudulent voting have been defeated, no matter what the facts show. We can still have distortions. I love this slide. not only with Jupiter and Neptune in Pisces, but Mercury is in Pisces March 3rd through the 27th after this Mercury retrograde. And when it goes through conjuncting both Jupiter and Neptune, these are my favorite Pisces mantras. What would you have me know, Source? What would you have me do, Source? And as I say to clients all the time, sometimes you have to ask and ask and ask the question to receive the answer. You ask until you do receive. Asking a question invites an answer. And when you ask it directly to Source, you really have to be willing to deeply, deeply listen to the intuitive hits. May you be successful. Now, one more time, I just want to show you here that the 4 inner planets are quite intimate with Pluto again this winter in those last degrees of Capricorn. So here specifically are the 3 dates again that Mercury conjuncts Pluto. And when you combined it with Venus, it is creating a deep, deep seriousness to life. We're reviewing our values and attitudes towards that material world. How do we choose to survive in our community? How are we experiencing our career? Is there a need for changes? How are our familiar relationships progressing? Are we at peace with our gender choices? Does something need to change there? Both of these Mercury and Venus retrograde cycles will go to the depth of our souls, Pluto. So what's okay in our world? What needs to change? And how are we going to go about surviving? Finally, last aspect is the Mercury aspects to the nodal axis. The south node is waxing sextiles. You can see on your screen here with Sag and Scorpio what we are talking about. You can see that the north node is making waning trine. Sorry, I have to change this word. That is trine. I'm going to make a note on my PowerPoint slides here. The waning sextiles is, going to be reflection. As we finish up South Node in Sag, are we making peace with our personal search for truth and how it operates in the world? As that South Node moves into Scorpio, can we dig deep into those emotional securities and woundings in order to heal our relationships with both resources, shared resources, Scorpio, and intimacy? North Node making waning trines. Oh, I think I've been saying waning, I mean waxing. North Node making waning trines. Gemini, North Node, a new ability to hear what is actually being expressed, as well as honoring our own voice with others. This is the achievement we want to be at as we are moving through those final degrees of the North Node in Sag. Taurus is going to open up searching for new levels of inner self-reliance. Again, through these changes in our material world and relationships. I only have one slide on the nodal axis with Mercury, but next Monday, I will be teaching a webinar on the nodal axis transit through Taurus, Scorpio for the next 19 months if you are interested. I'm going to finish up with some slides quickly. Here's Mercury stationary direct. Probably the biggest thing is that we have the sun now moving on to conjunct Saturn on the day or the next day after Mercury goes direct as it last quarter squares Uranus. And so the inclusive exclusive groups making the efforts to take charge of the national narratives on the future of our country. But the biggest thing to point out is all the planets when Mercury goes stationary direct are between Mars in Capricorn and Uranus in Taurus. They're all within a third of the chart. It doesn't look that way visually, but that's what's happening. 123 degrees, a third of the cycle. So there's a powerhouse of energy that's going to be released in specific direction and areas. Look at where this 123 degrees is in your natal chart. This is where that energy to take charge of life and bust forward in new ways, believing in yourself as you create in the world, will take place for you. Will it create any Earth events with the sun going on Saturn squaring Uranus or all these planets in Capricorn? Stay tuned. Will there be any political upsets and events that will take place? Stay tuned. Here is Joe Biden's chart with Mercury stationary direct. Mercury's going to oppose his Jupiter 3 times, as does transiting Pluto here. I just want to say that it doesn't matter whether it's the Democrats or Republicans, both political parties are undergoing death and rebirth because transiting Pluto is going over the natal US Pluto 3 times. Both parties are falling apart and having to reinvent themselves. I will say I think that the Democrats have a little bit better handle on facts and truth than the Republicans, but both are undergoing change. Biden, he faces some big reality checks. Mercury, Pluto, party division over country. And this one right here seems to take care of the rest. The failure of our economic policies and wealth inequalities, and to make changes better for all of us. The crumbling of infrastructure and social support systems like universal health care. That natural virus that is fighting for its own will to survive, that will mutate as much as possible. It will never leave us. It will just get to the point that it is like the yearly mutations of the flu virus that we all catch, survive, unless we're young or elderly or have morbidity issues with health. And so you can also see as the nodes here go into South Node Scorpio, going over his inner planets here, it's still going to be a pretty tough year for Biden. We might see him coming out stronger and stronger yet in regards to finding his voice, just because of Mercury and Pluto creating such a reality check for him with his own personal belief systems. Jupiter in the 9th, and his Jupiter Cancer just wanting to do a big cuddly with everybody. It's just, you know, those cycles of inclusive versus exclusive with our country. We're not near an inclusive cycle for a while yet. We're going to be battling it out for a few more years. Here's Donald Trump's chart. I wanted to just bring this up again because we know that in 2019 to 22, Neptune is squaring Uranus, nodal axis 5 times, then his moon, and finally Neptune's making last quarter squares to Sun 5 times, 21, 22. Here's the aspects in 22. I think Neptune Sun is going to continue to bring him a pretty direct reality check. You know, what lawsuits are going to be decided specifically through this Mercury retrograde? Mercury goes stationary retrograde, directly opposing his Pluto. Mercury is 10-18 here, and his natal is 10 Leo 2 minutes. So it doesn't go over it 3 times, but it is so close. And Uranus is still making this last quarter square. These Saturn-Uranus squares have been directly affecting his chart throughout this year. They're going to continue, Saturn and Uranus, to have their effect in 2022. And I think this contributes some to the reality check as well that is going on for him. When we look at the interior retrograde conjunction in Donald Trump's chart, I don't mean to be picking on him over Joe Biden. Venus goes stationary direct at 11 degrees, opposing his Mercury. And Venus opposes Donald Trump's Saturn and Venus 3 times during its Venus retrograde. Mercury opposes it. Mercury opposes Venus 3 times. And so there's still these reality checks again that are going to continue to go on with his family and all of the family inheritance of money and all of the family businesses. Remember, the moon, Chiron, Venus T-square hits specifically on this Neptune as well, in addition to, as I said previously, Mercury. Same themes continue forward. Here's Mercury stationary direct on Donald Trump's chart. Here's, as I said before, Venus and Mars following up, opposing that Mercury, squaring the Neptune. And then here's Mercury stationary direct, smack dab in between, opposing Saturn and Venus. Many ways it'll be more of the same for Trump in his actions and words. But I also think that the reality check in this country is going to be coming through for him. He has showed us the flaws in our country. He's done his work. It's time for him to move on. And it's time for him to meet his own karmic repercussions, reaping what he has sown. Here's the USA chart again with Mercury stationary direct, and you can see just how intensely Mercury stationary direct, 2422 Capricorn, the US natal Mercury 2420 Cancer. Whew, can't get any stronger than that. And that first US Pluto return, February 21st, is just mere weeks away from Mercury stationary direct on the 3rd, and Pluto already on that degree, just minutes away. So our entire structure of collective systems in the United States are in upheaval. Are we going to defend the past or progress into the future? And what do we value as a collective? Finally, the slide that I always leave us to part with. How do I objectify and understand my past? How do I become present in the moment? How do I find the courage to create my future? How do I prioritize what is important in my life? What are my goals in 2022? What is my plan of action in 22? How do I choose to participate as a social being on planet Earth? Here are our future Mercury retrogrades, where we always pay it forward. Here's the next webinar in May. And then I put all those Mercury retrograde webinars in to this slide, and we'll have Jupiter in Aries in May. We'll have a Mars retrograde this fall. I didn't leave my January 2022 forecast with the US Pluto return in this list, but you can go to this link right here and find it. Leroy has it up there. It has already been produced. And so finally, I leave you, as I do, with the chronological list of all the Mercury aspects that I put into these slides. this is all. Any comments or questions from anyone? Anything from you, Leroy?
No, you're all clear on the board, and with all that information, I think I'm just in a little bit overload. So no, it was great presentation. Thank you.
Capricorn overwhelm. I would say this Mercury retrograde is so active. It's just like many times when you get a session from an astrologer and you want the recording so you can go back and listen to it again and pick up what you didn't the first time. I would recommend that. We're going to have, I already prepped my, not the whole slides, but I already did my outlines for my Mercury retrogrades in 2022, just to know for the year. And we're going to have some Mercury retrogrades in the future that are going to be minimal aspects compared to this Mercury retrograde. This is the busiest one we've had in a long time. So if you are feeling overwhelmed, if you're feeling a sense of despondency, listen to this again and allow your own Aquarian insights and Leonian courage help spark you forward. All right, thanks for listening, everyone. All the best to you in the new year, and until next time.